Hello and welcome to my channel. My name's Amanda and I'm happy that you're here. In this season of Midnight Murmurs, Stories for Swift Nights, we've been reading stories out of Damnable Tales, a folk horror anthology. I dare you to say that 3 times fast. In episode 5 of this season of Midnight Murmurs, we will be reading A Witch Burning by Mrs. Baillie Reynolds. A witch burning? Why, that sounds like it might be interesting. Whether you're pro or against witch burning, I invite you to grab a beverage, kick back, and let's dive in. A Witch Burning by Mrs. Baillie Reynolds. First published in The Strand magazine, 1909. The dusk was falling upon the hard, frozen ground, covered with a light, powdery snow. Gilbert Cotton sat by the window of his lowly lodging, looking forth into the wide market square of the populous New England village of Mizpah. There before his eyes were the figures of men, warmly wrapped about from the piercing cold, busily engaged in piling faggots for the witch who was to be burned upon the morrow. As he looked forth, the young man was raging in his heart. He could not stop this thing that was to be, or he could stop it only as in bygone days the monk Telemachus stopped the public games at Rome, by being himself a martyr. He was an Englishman, and for 2 years had been in exile from his country, ministering to the handful of his own faith who dwell here among the nonconformists. He had no position, no influence. He could but sit by and see what horror men could work in the name of righteousness. He and his flock were taboo to the other inhabitants, and, though there was no open persecution now, there was a persistent hostility which gave churchmen a poor chance in the law courts and no chance at all in the way of public posts. And now a hideous tendency, dormant of late in the people, had awoke again in new strength. They had taken to witch burning. Only 6 months before, an old woman, widow of a sailor, who held the secret of an herbal preparation brought by her husband from far countries, had been dragged to the water, flung in, and cruelly tormented before being done to death. With that, the hunting instinct of the mob had been roused. Having once tasted the savage joy of pursuit, capture, and destruction, they thirsted for it again. And ere many months had passed there came tales of 2 witches, most undoubtedly possessed of occult powers, who lived in the depths of the Haraneck woods, wherein, as everybody knew, there lurked cougars, so that no woman unprotected by satanic powers could dwell there in safety. Or maybe they're just cat ladies. Day after day there sifted in tales of the skill of these women, of the marvels wrought by the mere muttering of a spell, in which the waving of hands played great and wondrous part. 2 men dispatched to take the offenders came back daunted and trembling, afraid to lay a hand on either of them. And thereupon the bloodlust swept raging through the town. The people turned out, and the women were hunted down with dogs and dragged to the town jail. At first, there was a division of opinion respecting their equal guilt. One of them, who was evidently the leader, had been burnt a week ago. And now news had come down that the second captive, who had been reported penitent, had been tampering with her jailers, had been bribing them to connive at her escape. So she, too, was to burn upon the morrow. And Cotton sat there, wondering what judgment God would send upon a town which, within a year, had murdered 3 defenseless women. He had some vague ideas floating through his head of trying to assemble 6 men to form a rescue. but he doubted if even that were possible. And as he mused, there was sharp knocking against his door from the street without. He rose and opened. There stood the burly form and the harsh-lined face of Brading, the village constable. He held a lantern in his hand, for dusk was falling and the night would be very dark. "His worship, in his mercy, has sent for you," he said in his husky tones. "Let no man say we give not even the most degraded their fair chance. The baggage down yonder, that is to burn tomorrow, says she belongs to the English faith. So come you down and say a prayer for her, and try to turn her thoughts from Satan to the Lord, for she will not listen to the godly exhorting of Master Lupton." Gilbert rose and stared wide-eyed at the messenger. What? Go and speak to this poor despairing creature of the mercy of God when she was to have no mercy from man? He quailed in his heart at the task. The constable burst into a hateful, husky titter. "He's afraid the witch'll put a spell on him," he chuckled. "Lord love you, man. Master Lupton, he's been in her cell nigh 2 hours, and that against her will, and she's not been able to hurt him through his faith in the Lord. But you that put your trust in forms and ceremonies, ye fear, and who can wonder at it?" A sudden impulse swept over Gilbert, calming him utterly. Without having spoken one word, he turned to a desk which stood by his table, took his books of devotions, and stowed them into the pocket of his cassock, which, like the clergy of his day, he wore habitually. Then he took from a peg his long cloak with thick capes and his wide-brimmed hat, and imitated that he was ready to follow Brading. It was almost night as they came out into the street and made their way, past the wide space where the pile of faggots rose a ghastly blot against the surrounding whiteness, up to the narrow throat of the street, where the houses began to cluster close, and so to the low, narrow stone archway, which was the entrance to the town jail. Brading let himself in with his own key, and they stood in the small waiting room, where 2 or 3 men were lounging by the glow heat of a great fire. The men greeted Gilbert with half-surly respect. His powerful physique and great strength procured for him a consideration which his blameless life and sincere simplicity might not have commanded. One of them told Brading that he had been summoned to go to the house of the mayor with regards to the proceedings of tomorrow. Brading was by no means unwilling, knowing that hot supper would be forthcoming at the mayor's house, so he forthwith departed, taking his lantern with him, and making a kind of apology that Gilbert must walk home in the dark. Gilbert hardly heard. He was watching the selection of a key by a man who had risen to attend him, and who now led the way down a corkscrew stair which seemed to descend to the bowels of the earth. The condemned cell. All was dark and silent within. Ketton took a torch from the man who held it, flashed the light round, saw an iron ring in the wall, and fixed the light there. "Knock loud when you want to come out," said the turnkey, and retired, slamming the iron door with a bang. Gilbert fixed his eyes upon the heap of rags huddled in the corner. "Good evening," he said, in his clear, high-bred voice. "God be with you." There was a rustle in the straw. The heaps of rags moved, turned towards him, and displayed, to his horror, the face of a young girl, hardly more than a child. She seemed all eyes. The stare of them burned his very soul. Her face was chalk white. Her streaming dark hair hung about it on either side, showing it up like a silver moon upon that dark sky. Her young, fresh mouth was piously curved. She had that terrible dumbness of appeal which one sees in the eyes of ill-treated animals. The sight of her froze the man's blood in his veins. "My daughter," he said, in a voice which was almost a sob of compassion. There came a quiver to her mouth, to her whole face. On her 2 hands she crawled nearer to him, a fearful questioning in her wild look. Was this really a human being speaking kind words to her, not cursing her? The young man threw off his cloak and hat and knelt down beside her in the straw. She laid her small hand, freezing cold, upon his outstretched palm. "You are warm," she said in a murmuring voice, "and you have brought a light. I have been in the dark, alone, so cold." In a transport of pity, he lifted her up and drew her into his arms, holding her head in the hollow of his elbow. "What do they mean?" he said unsteadily. "What do they mean by calling you a witch?" She faintly shook her head. "I don't know," she faltered in labored gasps. He looked about the horrible dungeon and saw on a shelf a water pitcher and mug. In his pocket was, as it chanced, a flask of wine and some biscuit which he had taken with him to bestow upon a poor parishioner earlier in the day, and found him away. He mixed wine and water and gave her to eat and drink, in his anxiety for her bodily needs forgetting all else as one does in such a case. The taste of the delicate biscuit drew her to eat. The wine made the blood flow again in her veins. As she ate and drank, he held her warmly wrapped in his cloak, and felt the icy rigidity of her limbs relax. And yet, was it kindness or cruelty? He asked himself. Had it been better to leave her in her stupor of cold and hunger? Might she have cheated the flames after all? Had he not brought her back to the full sense of her misery? "Tell me," he said at last, as she sat silent, her head fallen sideways against his shoulder. "What have you done? What have you said that they have condemned you a witch?" She sighed wearily. "Nothing that I know of. They said Granny was a witch, and I lived with her." "Was it true? Did your grandmother practice magic arts?" "She could put them to sleep by waving her hands about. She could cure pain by stroking the place. Is that wicked?" "Alas, I know not. Who taught her these things?" "She learned them long ago of a nurse she had, who was a gypsy. They were very rich, my grandparents, and they had a large estate. The Indians attacked them and killed my father and mother and almost everybody. Only Granny and I were left, and she was always queer after that. She would not live in town. She was full of strange fancies. But she was good to me. We were very happy till Joseph, our servant, died." "How long ago was that?" "I do not know. I forget. We buried him, and then Granny would not stay in that house. She said she would go to my uncle, who had a fine home in England and a park with swans and a lake and many servants. So we started off to walk to the coast, but she was old and ill. We found a little house in the wood and rested there, and the people found us out, and they were good to us till they came hunting us. Oh!" Suddenly she sat erect, threw up her hands, and screamed. "They will burn me! They will burn me!" she cried, madly. She flung her arms about his knees. "Are you kind? Are you human?" she cried. "Can't you save me from them? Can't you?" The sweat stood on the young man's forehead. It had come suddenly, so suddenly. Not a moment's interval between the everyday quiet of his usual existence and this sudden plunge into a life and death struggle. "Have you been baptized?" he asked her hurriedly. "Oh, yes, and confirmed too by a bishop," she said faintly. She was a sheep of his fold, and he must save her or die with her. Her name, she told him, was Luna Clare, the clear shining of the moon. He thought her well named. Rapidly his mind reviewed the position. The wild idea of passing her out in his habiliments crossed his mind. But the thing was impossible. She was much less than half his bulk. And even could he hope that, the jailers being drunk, such a plot could be carried out, once beyond the prison alone, what would become of her? She must die of exposure, be eaten by wild beasts, or retaken. She sat, watching with craving eyes the thoughts, the doubts, the trouble in his face. Her soft hand touched his. "Kill me," she breathed. "Kill me here, with your own hand. I do not fear death. I have nothing to live for. I only fear torture. Only to die shrieking with devilish men gloating on my agony. Kill me now. It is the only way." For a moment, he thought it was. Her head fell limply against his rough cassock. He held her in his arms, his clear gray eyes gazing out over her head, contemplating the situation. As he reflected upon the emaciation of the slight thing he held, an idea broke upon his mind that sent the blood with a rush to his face, that made his head reel a moment, then flooded him with a calmness and strength which surprised himself. "Luna," he said in a new voice, "will you swear to do whatever I bid you?" She moved, so that her small white face, with its pitous pointed chin, was upturned to his. She just breathed, "Yes," and hung upon his words. "Luna, you must trust me to the uttermost. In the eyes of God, I am your brother. You are safe with me." He rose to his feet. "Let me try how heavy you are," he muttered, and lifted her a slip of a body with an ease that astonished him. "It can be done," he said through his teeth. "God helping, it shall be done." From upstairs he caught a loud, vacant laugh, the snatch of a drunken song. In Brading's absence, the jailers were making merry. There was a slender chance for the success of his plan. His hesitation was over. He turned upon her, short and sharp. "I am going to put you on my back," he said, "and to carry you out of the prison under my cassock." In spite of his resolution, his face flamed as he said it. Luna looked neither afraid nor shocked. Her eye lit up. "Oh, I will be very still," she said with quick breathlessness. He was already divesting himself of his long garment, and stood before her, well knit and sturdy, in his gray flannel shirt and knee breeches. "Take off your frock," he bade her. "We must arrange it with a stuffing of straw in the corner to look like you." She caught his idea, stripped it off her, and there she was, bare-armed and fragile, in her poor petticoat, a creature of cloud and air. The hearts of the two young creatures throbbed with violence. They felt themselves alone against the world. Gilbert stooped and lifted the girl upon his back, so that her arms were locked about his shoulders. Her feet hung clear of the ground. With the broad sash of his cassock, he bound her firmly to him to decrease the weight upon her arms. With his knife he had previously slit his cassock all up the back, from below the waist to the neckband. Now he buttoned it round them both and flung over all his big cloak, which concealed the rent behind. The weight was greater than he had anticipated, but not greater than he could bear. All was ready. The frock, stuffed with straw, looked like a girl crouching in the corner. The imprisoned Luna hung perfectly quiet, her arms hardly perceptible under the thick cloak, whose hood concealed her head behind. He felt the warmth of her cheek against his shoulder. Then, standing on the threshold of his venture, he spoke a brief but strenuous prayer, and heard a soft voice sigh, "Amen," as he knocked and shouted for the turnkey to release him. The men above were so heavy with drink and the heat of their great fire that he had to knock and shout for some time before the man came. "Can you bear it?" he asked hastily at the last moment. She merely answered, "Yes." But the strength of 10 men seemed to uphold him as the door slowly opened. "God be good to us! God be good to us!" he muttered, lifting his hands in horror at the failure of his mission. "What, no success? Well, 'twasn't likely you should succeed where Brother Lupton failed," sniggered the turnkey. "Perhaps solitude and darkness may prevail," said Gilbert harshly, taking the torch and stamping it out with his feet. "Leave her to think over my words." It was more difficult than he had foreseen to ascend the narrow corkscrew stair. As he went slowly up, bumping his burden against the wall, he felt an insane desire to laugh, mingling with his fear. The sweat stood on his forehead, and his heart thumped like a machine as they emerged into the outer room, where the blaze of the fire lit up the place and threw the distorted outline of Master Catton's figure upon the wall. The dungeon below was locked for the night. Between them and their slender hope of escape stood now but one door. Fortunately, Gilbert had a small silver coin in his pocket. At the door he bestowed it on the turnkey, whose fellow was stretched upon the bench in a drunken slumber. "A cold night, friend," he said. "Here is somewhat to keep you warm." The turnkey muttered something inaudible. He was very tipsy indeed. He stooped to put the key in the door, and fell, a heavy mass, right across the threshold. Gilbert turned the key at once, but he hesitated to step over the prostrate man, who was not unconscious and was struggling to arise. He knew that Luna's feet, dangling within a few inches of the ground, must brush the jailer's nether limbs and might be perceptible even to senses fuddled with drink. Accordingly, he held out his hand with a friendly smile and encouraged the man to rise. Twice in vain he essayed to gain his feet, and twice fell back, while Gilbert gasped and staggered with the strain. At the third attempt up he came, and fell upon the young man with such a force as to cause him to stagger back with violence against the wall. It was quite unavoidable. He could do nothing but break the force of the impact. If the girl let forth a sound, they were undone. She remained perfectly silent, though he felt a shudder run through her limbs. He hardly knew what he had said to the tipsy fool, who now, melted by the gift of the coin, flung himself upon him to embrace him. That must be the end. Discovery was now inevitable. In anguish, Gilbert held up his arms. "Man, stop, my rheumatism! Have a little pity. Here, sit down on this stool. Another mouthful of this will strengthen you." He held the glass of steaming spirit which stood on the table to the sot's lips, and in the succeeding moment had opened the door and staggered out. Mizpah folks were early abed, and he found an empty street. He hastened along, reeling and staggering, the burden on his back seeming, like Christopher's, to grow heavier each moment. Suppose she should relax the clasp of her hands and slip to the ground? The strain must be awful. He stopped a moment to give a hoist, but the immediate slipping back which followed warned him that she was nearing the end of her resource. He pushed on, wild with apprehension, believing that, should he meet anyone upon the road, he must be detected. The sight of his shadow, cast by the firelight on the wall, had told him how mad a risk he ran. His own door, with the glimmering lantern above, seemed like a ray from heaven. He lived alone, a woman coming in each day to do his chores, as it was called. His supper would be laid, he knew. They must eat and then flee. What was he to do for clothes for the girl? He almost hurled himself within, drew the great bar behind him, and, stooping under the dead weight of an apparently inert burden, found his tinderbox and made a light, and with frantic fingers flung away his wrappings. The girl fell, limp and senseless, into his big chair and lay there, in the light of his lamp, so reduced by cruelty and privation that he was inclined to think his rescue of her was too late. The drops stood on his forehead as he began to realize what he had done. He had broken the law, made himself responsible for a girl from nobody knew where. Flight was imperative. And how was flight possible? His nerves were jarred with the strain of what he had undergone, but he set his teeth to the completing of his adventure, took the boiling kettle from the hot coals, made drink, and held it to her lips. By degrees she came back to consciousness. His clock told him that it was barely 8 o'clock. The whole night lay before the fugitives. When Luna was sitting up, drinking her milk and gazing timidly about, he also set to work to eat, while he tried to collect his wits and decide what he must take with him and whither shape his course. So far, he had succeeded. So far, they were free. But he started, and his face froze. There were steps and voices in the silent street without, hurried steps, coming from the direction of the prison. And as he sat, counting the hammer strokes of his heart, there was a loud and peremptory knocking upon his door. He raised his head and looked at the fragile waif girl who sat as if paralyzed. He rose and stood, a picture of perplexity. Then he was himself again. He crossed the room and looked at her a moment with a gaze of half command, half of appeal. She answered it as if he had spoken, rising to her feet and taking his hand. He led her across to the door of his bedroom, opened it, and said under his breath, In. She obeyed without words, without hesitation, and he shut and locked the door behind her, putting the key in his pocket as the knocking without was repeated, and more loudly. He threw his cloak over his damaged cassock and went to meet fate. Without, in the snowy night, stood 3 men. They seemed to be a gentleman and his 2 servants. The gentleman wore a costly and much befurred traveling suit, and his voice and courtly bow at once proclaimed him English. "Pardon this intrusion. Do I speak to Master Gilbert Catton, the parson here?" Gilbert admitted it. "Dare I beg for a few minutes of your valuable time, sir? I come merely to ask a question. I am here to trace my mother and my young niece. My name is Clare, Leonard Clare of Clare Hall, in the county of Devon. My father had a large estate west of this, which was attacked by Indians, and many of my family murdered. But I am told that my mother, with 1 child of my brother, escaped, and I have traced them with tolerable certainty to this district. The town authorities, however, tell me nothing is known of them here. As they are of the Episcopal faith, I deem that you might know something, and before leaving the place I venture to importune you." A sudden trembling of the limbs assailed Gilbert as he stood. With a motion to his guests to enter, he turned away and sank down into his chair, covering his face with his hands. Then, looking up with a dawn of hope and illumination, "Have you horses?" he eagerly demanded. "We have horses, yes." "Then it would be best to fly," said Gilbert huskily. Mr. Clare stood, majestic and astonished, in the small room, looking doubtfully at the young parson, whose sanity seemed questionable. "To fly?" he echoed. "The people of Mizpah," said Gilbert hoarsely, "burnt your mother as a witch. I saw her burn, without there, in the market. They have fixed the burning of your niece for tomorrow. There is a holiday, that the folks may see the sight." Mr. Clare let forth a kind of bellow. "To burn my niece? And you urge me to fly?" Gilbert nodded. He rose and went to his bedroom door. He threw it wide and called to the girl within. She came and stood in the doorway in her ragged petticoat, hunted, wild, shrinking, her great eyes dilated to their utmost. For 1 moment she stood poised there, then darted to Gilbert and clung to him with all her might. Don't, she shrieked. "Don't let them take me. Kill me yourself. Don't let me burn." She was so overwrought that it was long before Gilbert could make her understand that she was saved. Now that the way to act was plain to him, all his energy and resource returned. He explained the situation as clearly as he could to Mr. Clare. He felt sure that it would be unwise to wait until morning and tackle the authorities. The people, balked of their prey, would very likely break out and riot. Moreover, the inhabitants of all other villages in the district had the same blind fear and hatred of a witch, and so were potential enemies. The safest plan was to dress the girl in boy's clothes and to ride away there and then. The night lay before them, clear and fine, though cold. They must travel straight through till they gained the coast, and there take ship for England. He could find something for Luna to wear, and they could lend a spare cloak. Leonard Clare listened, with wrath in his heart, yet knowing that the advice was good. It was arranged that he should send his servants back to the inn to pay his reckoning and to bring his horses and his baggage. There was a spare horse for the carriage of such things as were necessary for travel, and until they were clear of the district and could buy another horse, Luna could ride that. There was need of urgent haste, and in the stress of the proposed flight, Leonard Clare had hardly time to realize the desperate part played by the young parson. But when Luna had been shut once more into the bedroom to wash and dress herself, the two men faced each other, and noting the blue marks under the younger man's eyes, Clare's heart smote him for an ingrate. He spoke then, in a fine, dignified way, of his indebtedness. He dare not insult the young man by offer of reward, but if there was anything that he could do... Gilbert thanked him quietly. He said simply that he could not leave the girl to be murdered. He had done what he could, and God had done the rest. He cut protestations short by sketching a map of the route he advised and giving minute directions. In the midst of all of it, the bedroom door softly opened, and there slipped out a slim figure in knee breeches and shirt, with hair all gathered away under a riding hat. Luna's timidity was gone. Her eyes were full of a new terrible idea. Going straight up to Gilbert, she said in her low, wondrous voice, "And what will you do?" He leaned across the table and looked her in the eyes. "Stay here and do my work," he said quietly. "And when they find I am gone, they will seize you." He shrugged his shoulders. "They may not. They may think the devil ran off with you in the night. If they do not think so, the mob will tear you to pieces. I can't help that. I have done my duty." The girl turned slowly from him, as if she could not tear her eyes from the dominion of his. She looked at her uncle. "I cannot leave here unless Master Catton comes too." "I must humbly beg to be forgiven. I had not realized the danger you have run by your heroic rescue of my niece," stammered Mr. Clare. "The events of this night, I think my wits are too weak, sir. But let me repair this. Come with us tonight, and your future career shall be my care." Gilbert hesitated, his face aflame. Luna went close to him and took his hand. "If he stays, I stay with him," she said clearly. The sound of horses at the door was heard. Voices mingled with the tramplings. The mayor had come to express regret that Mr. Clare was leaving the village with his inquiries unanswered. They came out and spoke with him. Gilbert explained that he was going a stage with Mr. Clare, who was not certain of the first 10 miles before striking the main road. He mounted the spare horse, and they put the page boy up before him. "Mind you get back in time for the burning," said the mayor anxiously. "We shall want you to say the final prayers." "There will be plenty of time for that," said Gilbert tranquilly. And that is the end of A Witch Burning. Cheers, we finally have a happy ending. I love that Gilbert was the knight in shining armor. He knew what they were doing was wrong, and he finally stood up for what he believed in. And he was willing to die for her. That is so sweet. And I love that she also refused to leave him behind. Oh, it's like the Last of Us pairing. Like, she's got a new dad in this parson. I'm relieved. Usually when you hear witch burning, it's not going to be a fun story. And I'm so happy that it turned positive and we got a happy ending. I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop the whole time. What a sweet story. Leave a comment down below, dear listener. Did you think that they were going to get caught in any point of this escape plan? I for sure thought they were going to get caught. Or, I don't know, he was going to bash her up against the wall and then it was going to turn out that he accidentally killed her anyways. Some deep, dark twist that ended up not happening. Whew, thankfully. And with that, we're officially halfway through season 4 of Midnight Murmurs. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for the second half of season 4 of Midnight Murmurs, Stories for Swift Nights. I hope you're having a wonderful summer. I appreciate your viewership, and I'll see you in the next video. Ciao.